no longer being gay and lesbian, that was voted out of the DSM a few years ago, but you're still mentally disordered if you are transgendered. The list is endless, so we don't know what the diagnoses were of these people. But to say that people who commit suicide are seriously mentally ill, you would kind of think that they might have one of the diagnoses of depression, psychosis, schizophrenia and bipolar, but very few of them had that. In 2004, a woman called Jane Purkis and a colleague of hers, a guy called somebody Burgess, Australian researchers worked with the World Health Organisation. They are very supportive of a mental health approach to suicide. So they reviewed 100 countries around the world, and they set out to prove that the countries that introduced a mental health approach to suicide would have reducing numbers of suicide. They were shocked to find that actually it introduced mental health initiatives, their suicide rates went up. Countries where they characterised suicide as a social issue and they addressed it with social strategies had the opposite. In 2000, Annette Beautray, the woman that we talked about before, wrote a paper which talked about how reducing access to the means of suicide is not effective where hanging is the primary means. Reducing access to the means of suicide is a really effective strategy in some countries in the world. In the United States, the most common way of committing suicide is to put a bullet in your brain or in your mouth. And so reducing access to firearms has been very successful in the United States in reducing suicide. In Asian countries, drinking weed killer is a very popular method of suicide, and so reducing access to weed killer has reduced suicides in many of those countries. But in a country like New Zealand, where almost 60% of suicides are hangings, this is not an effective strategy because you cannot reduce access to bed sheets and shoelaces, and in my son's case, garden hoses. So you know, it's just not going to work. Yeah. And in 2007, the Ministry of Health in New Zealand did a research report where they looked at whether people like me and Deb and Steve, who say these drugs killed our children, were in fact nutters, who were anti-big business and pharmaceuticals and all the rest of it. And what they found in their report is that as prescribing goes up in New Zealand, as it is at the moment 10% per annum, so does hospitalisation for serious self-harm. The lines mirror each other exactly. So this is what we know from the research about whether a mental health approach to suicide is effective. And what it tells us is actually it's not. And we know from clinical studies that antidepressants do increase the risk of suicide, particularly in young people. They at least double the risk of suicide. Every psychiatrist in New Zealand will tell you that. That's medically proven fact. And yet nowhere in the New Zealand suicide prevention strategy do we say reducing the amount of prescribing to people in New Zealand. Oh, sorry, and the other thing that we know in relation to New Zealand's suicide prevention strategy is that while our strategy is about silence and preventing media reporting and preventing parents talking about what's happened to their children, the research shows that reporting on suicide can actually be hugely protective. And that's certainly been the case with families that we've spoken to. My son's friends will tell you that before my son died, they had all considered, I mean, kids know about suicide. They'd all thought about it as an option at times in their life. Some of them had gone so far as to make a plan. But having witnessed the total destruction of Toran's mother, you know, after Toran died, not only did I lose my only child, I lost my future role as a grandmother. I will never be a grandparent. I will never have any descendants. I lost my job. I lost my home. You know, I just lost everything, and these children who love me very much see that I spend 80% of my life in tears, that I'm not the woman I used to be. And what they say is, now that we've seen that, we could never ever do it to our mums. And so that sits well with research that shows that reporting on the aftermath of suicide is a huge deterrent and can be very protective in terms of preventing suicide. This is the Ministry of Health data on the methods used for suicide in New Zealand, and you'll see that hanging is by far the most prevalent method of suicide. The Mental Health Foundation, who we thought would really hate us when we set up Casper, because we are challenging this whole mental health approach to suicide, have actually been really supportive of what we're saying, and they meet with us regularly. And they sent to us recently a study that they have done on the effect of diagnostic labelling on people. They did a number of focus groups with people, and they asked people, what was the effect on you of being told that you suffer depression, or you are schizophrenic, or you are bipolar, or you have ADHD, or whatever? And they thought that people would say, oh, other people treated me differently and I was stigmatised by other people. But what people said was, I lost my sense of self. I'd known that things were really tough for me at the moment and I was not functioning very well. But the moment they put a label on me, I felt like an alien and I didn't feel like me anymore. Instead of being Maria, I was a psychotic. And they said for the first time, I considered suicide because I didn't belong to the community anymore. So the Mental Health Foundation is really on board with our view that sticking labels on people is actually really harmful rather than a suicide prevention strategy. We also make the point that sticking diagnostic labels on people makes an absolute mockery of valuing diversity. Because as those diagnoses expand, there are almost 400 psychiatric disorders listed in the DSM, and there's a new DSM coming out in 2013 which will expand it even further. So we're going to have things like compulsive shopping disorder, compulsive hoarding disorder. Oh, is that your one?
Me today.
But increasingly, because these disorders are not based on science, like heart disease or diabetes or whatever, there are no blood tests, there are no x-rays. So what happens in the development of these disorders is that they are voted in and out by a panel of psychiatrists. And so, for example, homosexuality used to be a mental disorder. And then when it became politically unsustainable to continue saying that people who were gay were mentally ill, and the pressure came on, they voted that out. Now, can you imagine medical doctors voting diabetes in or out as a medical disorder? But that's how these things happen. And increasingly, unless you are a white, middle-class, American psychiatrist, you're abnormal. And every one of us in this room could be diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder. There is absolutely no doubt about that at all. So how do we implement this strategy in New Zealand of taking a mental health approach to suicide prevention? Well, the first thing we do is we market disorders. And we get people like John Kerwin to go on television and say, if you feel sad, if you're not coping, then you've probably got depression and you should go and see your doctor. Or you go on depression.org where there's a self-test for depression. And if you look really closely down the bottom, you'll see that that self-test depression was produced by Pfizer, the manufacturer of an antidepressant. But it says, if you tick 5 of these boxes, you are likely to suffer from clinical depression, go and see your doctor. Recently, we've had the Royal College of Australia and New Zealand Psychiatrists had a big conference in New Zealand. One of the big topics of conversation is that people who are concerned about global warming, people who turn lights off when they leave a room, people who are concerned about conserving water, probably meet the diagnostic criteria for obsessive compulsive disorder and an anxiety disorder. We also have orthorexia nervosa, Orthorexia nervosa is a condition where you are concerned about avoiding pesticides on food, where you eat organic produce and you're concerned about what you put in your body. That is an eating disorder along with anorexia nervosa and bulimia. We've heard about female hypoactive sexual disorder. That is where women don't have a high enough sex drive. I mean, according to who? According to the manufacturer of the